friends, it's Betty here with another recipe tutorial, and if you're new here, I am the baking instructor on this channel and over at bakerbettie.com. And today we are going to be making focaccia. Now this is one of my most highly requested recipes, and the way I make it is actually incredibly simple. I use the same method if I'm going to be using dried yeast or if I'm using my sourdough starter, so you can use either in this recipe and I will give you details for both. Now the first step of this process is the Autoleaf step, which just means I'm going to mix my flour and water together before I add any of the other ingredients. So I'm measuring out 500 grams of bread flour here, or you can also use unbleached all-purpose flour, and I'm adding to that 400 grams of room temperature water. Now all you're going to do is stir that together until it is well combined. This is a very high hydration dough, which means that there's a lot of water in it and it's going to be quite sticky. Now after the water and flour are mixed, it's going to be a really shaggy dough, and it's also going to rip really easy if you try to pull up on it. And this just means that the gluten structure has not formed at all yet. So now we're going to cover the bowl and let it rest for a minimum of 30 minutes and up to 2 hours. And this process is going to jumpstart our gluten development and allow us to make this bread without any kneading or stretch and folds. After the mixture has rested, you will see that it has changed quite a bit. The flour has had a chance to completely hydrate, and when you pull up on the dough, it's really stretchy. And this is because that gluten structure has started to form. So now we can go ahead and mix in the rest of our ingredients. If you're using dried yeast, you're going to use just 1/4 teaspoon of instant yeast and just sprinkle that over the top. Or if you want to use your natural sourdough starter, you can add 50 grams of fed and ripe starter here. Now we'll just add 2 tablespoons of olive oil, and we're going to give all of that a quick mix before we add in the salt. So use your hands to start pinching and folding the dough to incorporate the ingredients, and it's going to be very, very wet. Once that is somewhat combined, you can go ahead and sprinkle 10 grams of fine sea salt or kosher salt over the top and begin pinching and folding the dough to continue mixing that in. We aren't kneading the dough here, we're just making sure all of those ingredients are completely combined. And I do this for about 2 minutes to make sure everything is really well mixed. Once the dough is mixed, you're going to grease a 9 by 13 inch pan with 1 tablespoon of olive oil. And you're going to pour the dough into that pan and then turn the dough over to coat it in oil. Now you can go ahead and gently start stretching it out to fit the pan. And it's likely going to want to fight you here, so it's not going to stretch all the way out to the edges, but just stretch it as much as it will allow you to, and then cover it and let it rest for about another 20 to 30 minutes. Once you've let it rest for a little while, it should work with you much easier to let you stretch it out to fit the pan. Now it's time to let it ferment, and you have 2 options for this. You can let it ferment at room temperature for about 8 hours, or you can put it in the refrigerator to slowly ferment for at least 24 hours and up to 72 hours. Cold temperatures are going to slow down the activity of the yeast, which allows it to ferment for longer and also gives you a much more flavorful bread. Now I let mine cold ferment for about 24 hours, and you can see here that it's really puffy and filled with air when I pulled it out of the refrigerator. If yours isn't very puffy when you pull it out, you can let it sit at room temperature for longer until it is full of air before baking. Now before I bake this, I'm going to drizzle about 1 more tablespoon of olive oil over the top, and I'm adding some chopped fresh rosemary. Now the rosemary is completely optional, or you can do other toppings that you like. I'm also adding some coarse salt over the top, and the one I'm using here has some dried herbs in it, but a coarse kosher salt or a flaky sea salt is also really nice. And the last step before we go into the oven is to take our fingertips and start making dimples all over the dough. This is what gives the bread that iconic look that focaccia has. Now we're going to bake in a 450 Fahrenheit oven for about 18 to 23 minutes until the bread is golden brown. Now when the bread comes out of the oven, it should be slightly crispy on top and on bottom, and it should have that beautiful airy center. This is one of my absolute favorite breads to make. There is a lot of time involved, but almost all of that time is hands off, and I know you can make this. Now I really hope you enjoyed this recipe tutorial, and if you did, make sure you give it a thumbs up and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a video. I'm always happy to answer your questions, so you can leave those down in the comment section, and I will see you back here next time with another recipe tutorial.